The Montana winter of 1872 was a merciless thing, a beast of ice and wind that didn't care who you were or what you were running from. But it was nothing compared to the secrets Catherine Reed carried buried deep in her heart. They were colder than any blizzard, sharper than any frost. Her wagon wheel had splintered like a dry bone 15 miles from a town called Silver Creek, a name on a map she'd picked with a blind finger, a place to disappear. Now the wilderness was closing in. She heard the wolves first, a low, hungry choir in the darkness. Then she saw them, yellow eyes like demonic lanterns, circling an overturned cart just up the path. A family was huddled behind it, small shapes trembling in the moonlight. Kate's hand, slick with nervous sweat, found the cold steel of the Colt revolver tucked beneath her wool coat. It was her father's last gift, a heavy, deadly piece of reality. The metal was cold against her palm, but not as cold as the realization that had been setting in for months. She was truly, utterly alone, a woman with a senator's blood on her hands, haunted by her dead husband's ghost, running for her life toward a frontier town where nobody, absolutely nobody, could know her real name. Then the gunshots rang out, but they didn't come from the wolves. They came from a man on horseback, a silhouette against the stars. His rifle cut through the biting cold, each shot a punctuation mark of deadly precision. The wolves scattered, melting back into the shadows they came from. He rode like death itself, his shoulders broad and powerful, a man carved from the very granite of the mountains around them. And when he finally turned his horse toward her, Kate saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. The look of a kindred spirit, someone else who knew the crushing weight of unforgivable sins. The question hit her like a physical blow. Was this man her salvation? Or had she just run from one monster straight into the arms of another? Would the secrets she carried get them both killed before the sun ever rose over the Montana territory? Stick with me, because what happened next, in that frozen wasteland, will change everything you think you know about survival. I don't need your help, Kate said, her voice a low growl that surprised even herself. The words were a lie, and the wolf howls echoing in the distance were the proof. 20 yards away, the Wilson family was a knot of pure terror behind their broken wagon. The man on the horse looked down at her. His face was weathered, etched by sun and hardship, as hard as the landscape itself. Jackson Blackwell. He didn't even have to say his name. He looked like a man named Jax. Maybe not, ma'am, but they do. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the family. And out here, we help each other, or we die alone. There was something in his voice, a deep, resonant gravity that spoke of things seen and done. It spoke of men who hadn't made it home, of impossible choices made in the dark that haunted a man's waking dreams. Kate recognized that sound. She heard it in her own soul every single night. The only difference was that her ghost wore expensive three-piece suits and carried congressional medals instead of rifles. Catherine Reed, she said, the lie slipping from her lips with a practiced ease she'd perfected over 3 long months of running. She offered her hand as he dismounted from his horse. Jackson Blackwell, he replied, his grip firm, his hand calloused from what felt like a lifetime of honest, back-breaking work. Most folks just call me Jax. As they worked together, Jax and Kate, to repair the Wilson family's wagon wheel, she couldn't help but watch him. He moved with a quiet, deadly economy. Every action was precise, measured, with no wasted energy. He moved like a soldier. When he rolled up his sleeves to get a better grip on the heavy wheel, she saw it. A scar. It ran the length of his forearm, a jagged white line against his sun-darkened skin. War? She asked, her voice barely a whisper above the whistling wind. Among other things, he said, not looking at her. But then he did. His blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. And for a split second, the vast, empty Montana wilderness just fell away. There was a sharp intelligence in those eyes, a depth that went on forever. It made her pulse quicken in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the wolves or the cold. But there was something else in his gaze, too, a flicker of a question. He wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her, and she had the unsettling feeling that he saw far too much. By the time they finally limped into Silver Creek, the dawn was painting the sky in brutal shades of pink and gold. The town was smaller than Kate had hoped, smaller and harder. A single main street, lined with weathered, weary buildings, a church with a steeple that leaned like a tired old man, and maybe at most 300 souls all trying to carve some semblance of civilization out of the raw, unforgiving wilderness. "You'll be wanting the boarding house," Jack said, gesturing with his chin. But the tone of his voice suggested he knew that wasn't the whole story. Kate studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled just a little at his collar. "Actually," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'm here about the teaching position." That got his attention. He turned fully in his saddle, and those penetrating blue eyes took her in all over again. Her traveling dress, now dusty and worn but still of a fine cut. The way she spoke, the clear, refined speech of the Boston elite. The way she held her chin up, like someone who was accustomed to being listened to. "Silver Creek's not exactly Boston, Miss Reed," he said, a hint of a challenge in his voice. "Good," she replied without missing a beat. "Boston couldn't contain me." Something shifted in his expression then. Surprise, maybe. Or maybe it was a flash of approval, of respect. "Most women wouldn't last a week out here," he stated, a simple fact. Kate's chin lifted another inch, and when she spoke, her voice carried the hard, sharp edge of steel that had gotten her through 3 months of hell. 3 months of running, of sleeping with one eye open, of wondering if each sunrise would be her last. "I'm not like other women," she said. Jax's smile was slow, dangerous, and entirely, devastatingly male. "No, ma'am," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm beginning to think you're not." He paused, letting the silence hang in the cold morning air between them. "And that's probably for the best. The last teacher we had, she disappeared." The Silver Creek schoolhouse hadn't seen a teacher in 2 years, and it looked like it had been in a fight with the wilderness and lost. Windows were shattered, the roof sagged in the middle like a tired swayback horse, and the few books left behind were so old the pages crumbled into dust at the slightest touch. But Kate had stared down worse odds than a dilapidated building. She had stared down United States senators and their hired thugs. What she hadn't prepared for, though, was a man named Samuel Morrison. He owned half the town, the general store, the bank, the saloon. His word out here in the middle of nowhere was law. In a place where federal authority was just a distant rumor, Morrison was king. He was tall with a mane of silver hair, and he carried himself with the easy, arrogant bearing of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. But there was something else about him, something chillingly familiar that made the hairs on the back of Kate's neck stand up, though for the life of her, she couldn't place why. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. He walked into her schoolhouse on her third day without bothering to knock. "I trust you're settling in well." "As well as can be expected, Mr. Morrison," Kate replied, not bothering to stop scrubbing the grime off the ancient blackboard. She learned a long time ago that showing a moment of weakness to men like Samuel Morrison was like bleeding in a tank full of sharks. "You have an interesting background," he mused, circling the room like a predator sizing up its prey. "Boston, wasn't it? From a fine family, I'm sure." The scrub brush in her hand stopped moving. "Just for a second. My family is my own concern, sir." "Of course, of course." Morrison's smile was a cold, thin line. It didn't touch his eyes. "It's just that in a small, tight-knit town like ours, we like to know our neighbors. For their protection, you understand." The threat was subtle, wrapped in a veneer of concern, but it was as unmistakable as a coiled rattlesnake. Kate turned slowly to face him, letting him see the unyielding steel in her green eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Morrison, but I assure you, I am perfectly capable of protecting myself." After he left, her hands trembled so badly she sloshed tea from her thermos onto the dusty floor. She had run 2,000 miles. She had changed her name, her history, her entire life. And still, somehow, the past was breathing down her neck. That evening, Jax found her at the old church ruins just on the edge of town. The building had burned down years ago in a fire no one ever talked about, leaving only the stone walls and a whole lot of ghosts. Kate was sitting on what used to be the altar steps, her dark hair unbound and loose around her shoulders. The last rays of the setting sun turned her skin to gold. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice a low rumble as he sat down beside her. So close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "They all are lately," she admitted, her voice tight. She didn't look at him, but she was acutely aware of his presence, the clean, simple scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Morrison's been asking questions about you," Jack said, getting straight to the point. That made her turn. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud against her ribs. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make a man wonder what a well-educated woman from a wealthy Boston family is really doing teaching in a forgotten scrap of a town like Silver Creek." Jack's voice was gentle, but his eyes were deadly serious. "Kate, if you're in some kind of trouble, we all have our secrets, Jax." The words came out sharper, more brittle than she intended. "I imagine you have a few of your own." His laugh was a short, bitter sound. "More than my share." He was quiet for a long, heavy moment, his gaze fixed on the endless, bruised purple of the Montana sky. "I was a colonel in the war," he said finally, his voice flat. "I led a company of good men into what I was told was a strategic position, a valley with good cover. It turned out to be a trap, an ambush." Kate's breath hitched. She could hear the raw, unhealed pain in his voice, as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. 23 men died because I made the wrong call," he continued, his voice thick with a guilt that time had not lessened. "Including my younger brother, Daniel. He was just 19 years old. He followed me into hell itself because he believed I knew what I was doing." Without thinking, without conscious thought, Kate reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm, strong, scarred from work and from war. They closed around hers. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. He looked at her then, and she saw it all. The guilt that ate him alive from the inside out. The crushing weight he carried with him every single day. "I was their leader," he said, his voice ragged. "Their lives were my responsibility. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since, haven't you?" The question hung in the air between them, both a challenge and an offering of understanding. In that moment, Kate felt her own carefully constructed walls, the ones she had built brick by painful brick over the last 3 months, begin to crumble. Here was a man who understood. He understood the weight of secrets. He understood the burden of decisions that could never, ever be undone. "My husband was murdered," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "And the man who killed him, he's one of the most powerful men in America." Jax's hand tightened around hers, a silent anchor in the storm that was her life. "I saw it happen," she choked out. "Thomas was a journalist. He was investigating corruption, following money trails that led all the way back to people who don't tolerate being investigated. I tried to tell the police. I tried to tell everyone. But who would believe a grieving widow over a decorated, powerful United States senator?" The words poured out of her now, a torrent of fear and grief held back for 3 agonizing months. She told him everything, about the late-night visits from well-dressed men with dead eyes, the subtle threats, the way doors in Boston society had suddenly slammed shut in her face. She told him how she'd taken back her maiden name, sold every last thing she owned, and fled west, to the only place she could think of where the long, corrupt arm of a powerful man from Washington couldn't reach her. "That's why you carry the gun," Jack said. It wasn't a question. "Among other reasons," she confirmed. Kate pulled her hand free, instantly missing the warmth and the strength of his. "I'm not the innocent school teacher this town thinks I am, Jax. I'm a fugitive. And if Morrison keeps digging, then we'll deal with Morrison." The absolute certainty in his voice made her look up. In the dying light, with the ruins of the church around them, Jax Blackwell looked like something out of a legend. Strong, steadfast, the kind of man who would ride headlong into impossible odds simply because it was the right thing to do. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why would you risk everything for me? You barely know me." He stood up, towering over her for a moment, and then extended his hand to help her to her feet. When she took it, he didn't let go. He pulled her closer, so close she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her own chest. So close she could see the fire of a desire he was fighting and failing to contain. Because, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, some things are worth the risk. But as he said it, his eyes flickered down to the scar on his own forearm, and a shadow passed over his face, a shadow that looked an awful lot like a lie. The storm hit 3 nights later. It came out of nowhere, turning the Montana sky into a bruised, angry black and unleashing sheets of rain that lashed the prairie like God's own fury. Kate was working late in the schoolhouse, grading papers by the flickering light of an oil lamp, when the door suddenly burst open with a crash. Jack stood in the doorway, framed by the raging storm. He was soaked to the skin, his white shirt clinging to the hard planes of his chest. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair, and his eyes held an intensity that stole the breath right out of Kate's lungs. "The roof at my place is leaking," he said, his voice a low growl over the roar of the wind. "Bad. I need a place to wait out the storm." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jackson Blackwell's ranch house was the most solid, well-built structure for 100 miles in any direction. But Kate just nodded anyway, because the storm that was brewing inside of her was 100 times fiercer than the one raging outside. "Of course," she said. He stepped inside, pushing the heavy door closed against the gale. The small schoolhouse suddenly felt tiny, intimate, charged with a crackling electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning that was splitting the sky in two. "You should get out of those wet clothes," Kate said, and then immediately felt a hot flush creep up her neck at her own boldness. Jax's smile was slow, predatory, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Should I? The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken things. Kate set down her pen, her hands not quite steady. "There's a blanket in the supply closet." But when she turned to get it, Jax's hand shot out and caught her wrist, spinning her back around to face him. They were close now, so close she could see the individual droplets of water clinging to his dark eyelashes. She could smell the rain on him, and the leather, and something else. Something indefinably masculine that made her knees feel weak. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a touch so gentle it was almost agonizing, and Kate felt herself melting. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with kindness, with gentleness. So long since she'd felt anything other than bone-deep fear and the cold, empty comfort of solitude. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle at all. It was with the raw, desperate hunger of a man who'd been drowning and had finally found air. Kate responded with an equal, startling ferocity, her hands fisting in his wet shirt, pulling him closer still. She could taste the rain on his lips, feel the barely leashed power in the arms that wrapped around her like steel bands. His hands found the tiny buttons of her blouse, and she didn't stop him. She couldn't. Instead, her own fingers, trembling with a want so fierce it scared her, began working on the buttons of his shirt. 3 months of iron-willed control, of constant vigilance finally shattered into a million pieces. The wet fabric fell away, revealing the hard, scarred landscape of his chest. A map of a life lived in violence and survival. Her fingertips traced the jagged line of the scar on his forearm, the one she'd noticed before. Jax groaned, a low, guttural sound, and his hands tangled in her dark hair, tilting her head back. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against the sensitive skin of her throat, his lips finding the frantic pulse that hammered there. "So damn beautiful." Kate arched against him, lost. Lost in the sensation, in the feel of his hands on her skin, the heat of his mouth, the way he whispered her name like it was a prayer. Her skirt rustled as his hands found the ties, and she felt herself being consumed by a fire she'd thought had died a long, long time ago. She'd thought it was dead and buried with her husband. She was wrong. This was madness. This was salvation. This was... The schoolhouse door didn't just open. It exploded inward, ripped from its hinges. Samuel Morrison stood framed in the doorway, a rifle held steady in his hands. Behind him, 5 of his men, their faces grim in the flashes of lightning. Morrison's cold, dead eyes took in the scene in an instant. Kate, disheveled, her blouse half undone. Jax, shirtless, stepping protectively in front of her. Morrison's lips curled back from his teeth in a smile that was all predator. "Well, well," he said, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "What have we here?" Kate's blood turned to ice in her veins, because in that moment, illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, she finally saw what had been nagging at the edges of her memory, a resemblance she hadn't been able to place, a family resemblance. "You have his eyes," she breathed, the words stolen from her lungs. Morrison's snake-like smile widened. "Clever girl. Senator Benjamin Hayes is my brother-in-law." He took a step into the room, the rifle never wavering. "And you, my dear Catherine Hayes. Yes, I know who you really are. You have been causing my family a considerable amount of embarrassment." The world tilted on its axis. Kate felt Jax tense beside her, his body coiling like a spring, ready to fight. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught completely by surprise. "That's right," Morrison continued, savoring the moment, enjoying her shock and terror. "Catherine Hayes, widow of that meddlesome journalist, Thomas Hayes, daughter-in-law to the man who will be the next president of the United States. Did you really think you could just disappear into the wilderness? Family has a way of finding family." "What do you want?" Jack's voice was deadly calm, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "Mr. Blackwell, isn't it?" Morrison sneered. "The disgraced colonel, the one who led his own men, his own brother, to the slaughter. My research has been thorough." He shifted his gaze back to Jax. "I want you to get on your horse, ride out of my town tonight, and never ever come back. In exchange for your cooperation, I won't tell the good people of Silver Creek what kind of woman they've been trusting their children with." "And if I refuse?" Jax asked, his hands held out slightly from his sides. Morrison's smile turned positively feral. "Then I kill you both. I'll tell everyone you died trying to force yourself on our poor, innocent school teacher. It's a tragedy, but who's going to contradict my version of events?" Kate closed her eyes, the crushing weight of inevitability pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had run as far as she could run. She had fought as hard as she could fight, but the past had finally caught her. It had her in its jaws, and it wasn't letting go. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Both men looked at her, surprised. "No," Kate said again, louder this time, a core of hard, unbending steel entering her voice. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. And I am sick and tired of men like you thinking you can control my life." She took a deliberate step away from the protective wall of Jax's body. Her hand moved in a smooth, practiced motion to the Colt revolver at her hip. She looked Samuel Morrison dead in the eye. "You want me?" she said, her voice ringing with a challenge. "Come and take me." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Silver Creek, a story told and retold for decades to come. Kate's draw was a blur of motion, faster than anyone, especially Morrison's men, could have possibly expected. The training her father had drilled into her, day after day, year after year, paid off in a single, heart-stopping second. Her first shot didn't hit Morrison. It hit the rifle in his hands, sending it spinning into the darkness. Her second shot was even more precise. It shattered the oil lamp on her desk, plunging the entire schoolhouse into a chaotic, flickering blackness, lit only by the violent, intermittent flashes of lightning from the storm outside. Jax moved like the soldier he was. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He reacted, rolling behind the heavy teacher's desk, just as Morrison's men recovered from their shock and opened fire. Splinters exploded from the walls. Kate dove for the relative safety of the supply closet, her mind a whirlwind of tactical possibilities, of angles and cover, of lessons her father had taught her on long afternoons when her mother believed they were practicing her penmanship. "The back window!" Jax yelled, his voice cutting through the deafening roar of gunshots. "Can you make it?" "Not without you," she screamed back. "You have to go. Get out of here." "I said no." Her voice was a blade in the chaos. "We do this together, or not at all." And in the darkness, behind the splintered wood of the teacher's desk, Jax felt something shift deep inside his chest. some frozen, locked-away part of his heart, a place that had been dead since the day he'd watched his brother die, finally, painfully, began to thaw. This woman, this fierce, impossible, incredible woman, was choosing to stand and fight beside him, to die beside him rather than save herself. Maybe this, he thought, in the middle of a gunfight for his life. Maybe this is what redemption looks like. The battle was brief, but it was brutal and vicious. Morrison's men had the numbers, but they were paid thugs. They lacked the desperate, cornered animal fury of two people fighting with absolutely nothing left to lose. When the thick, acrid gun smoke finally began to clear, 3 of Morrison's men lay dead on the floorboards. 2 more were wounded, groaning in the darkness. And Morrison himself was on his knees in the wreckage of what had been Kate's classroom, clutching a bloody shoulder wound. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled, his face twisted with pain and rage. "Senator Hayes will destroy you both. He will hunt you down. He'll make you disappear." Kate walked toward him, the barrel of her Colt still smoking, her hand as steady as a rock. In the strobing flashes of lightning, she looked like an avenging angel, beautiful and terrible and completely, utterly unafraid. "Let him try," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "But first you're going to sit down at that desk, and you're going to write a letter to the territorial governor. You're going to confess to extortion, to murder, to conspiracy, and you are going to name every single name, starting with your brother-in-law." "I'll never," he started to say, but his voice died in his throat as Kate pressed the warm muzzle of the Colt against his temple. "Samuel, dear," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "you seem to be laboring under the mistaken impression that I am the same frightened little girl who ran from Boston 3 months ago." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not." Her smile was as sharp and as cold as winter steel. "I am Catherine Hayes, and I've decided I'm done being afraid." It took 2 long, grueling hours to get Morrison's full confession down on paper, but Kate was nothing if not thorough. By the time the storm broke and the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, she had it, a full, detailed account of the corruption, the murders, the network of lies and greed that stretched all the way from the dusty streets of Silver Creek to the marble halls of Washington, D.C. She had enough evidence to bring all of them down. As the sun rose over the Montana Territory, painting the bruised sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kate and Jack sat together on the stone ruins of the old church, the same place where they had first shared their secrets. They were both bandaged, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but they were alive. "So," Jax asked, his voice rough, "what now?" Kate leaned her head against his solid shoulder, drawing comfort and strength from his presence. "Now," she said, looking at the confession in her hands, "I send a copy of this to every major newspaper between here and the Atlantic Ocean. Benjamin Hayes's presidential ambitions will be dead and buried by the time the morning edition hits the streets." "And us?" he asked quietly. She turned her head to look at him then. This man, this broken, honorable man who had stood by her side when the entire world seemed to be arrayed against them. His blue eyes held a question, a deep and vulnerable question that she wasn't sure she was ready or even able to answer. "I don't know," she said, with brutal honesty. "I've spent so long running, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." Jax's hand, scarred and warm, found hers, his fingers intertwined with hers, a perfect fit. "Maybe," he said, his voice gentle, "maybe it's time to learn." 2 years later, Catherine Blackwell stood in front of the finest schoolhouse in the entire Montana Territory, watching her students diligently practice their letters on their slates. The building was new, built of solid pine, with large glass windows that let the sunlight stream in. It had been built with money confiscated from Samuel Morrison's illegal accounts after his very public trial. The scandal that had erupted from his confession had destroyed Senator Hayes, rocking the foundations of Washington for months. But out here in Silver Creek, life had slowly, surely settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. Kate taught the town's children during the day. She tended to her small but thriving garden in the evenings. And every single night, she fell asleep wrapped in the arms of a man who had taught her that love wasn't about forgetting the past or trying to outrun your ghosts. It was about choosing to build something better, something stronger in spite of them. Mrs. Blackwell? Little Emma Wilson, the same girl she had seen cowering behind the overturned wagon on that first fateful night, raised her hand, her eyes wide. Will you tell us another story? A story about the old days? Kate smiled, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on the slight, gentle swell of her belly, where new life was growing, a testament to the future. Of course, Emma. What kind of story would you like to hear today? The scary kind, piped up James Morrison, Samuel Morrison's young nephew, who now lived with relatives who actually cared about his future and his education. With wolves and gunfights and heroes. Heroes, Kate mused, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, she could see Jax repairing a fence post. His shoulders were still just as broad, his movements still just as economical and strong. But the haunted, hunted look that had been in his eyes when she first met him was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. Well, let me tell you about heroes, children, she said, turning back to the eager faces of her students. They aren't the men and women who never make mistakes or who never fall down. The real heroes are the ones who fall down and get back up. They get back up and they keep on fighting for what's right, no matter how hard it is. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, weaving a tale of courage and redemption, of love found in the darkest and most desperate of places, of second chances that were earned through blood and tears and sacrifice. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the sweet scent of wild roses and new beginnings, of possibility and of hope. As the warm afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, Kate caught Jax's eye through the glass. He stopped his work and smiled at her. That slow, devastating smile that still, after 2 years, made her heart beat just a little bit faster. He touched two fingers to the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part salute, part promise. Some scars, Kate had learned, never fully healed. Some ghosts never entirely disappeared. But sometimes, if you were very, very lucky and very, very brave, you found someone who was willing to help you carry those burdens. Someone who understood that redemption wasn't a final destination you arrived at. It was a choice you had to make every single day, the choice to keep believing in tomorrow, even when yesterday did its best to destroy you, the choice to love despite the cost, the choice to stay. If this story moved you, share it with someone you know who believes in the power of second chances. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the American frontier, where courage and love rode hand in hand across an untamed land. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know where these stories are finding their home.